Hello, everyone. Well, really, I'm here tonight to tell you a story. And this is a story that I have learned from a falcon. Now, it wasn't any kind of falcon, but a peregrine falcon, so one of those that appear all over the world. And the story that he told me starts with the emergence of a new kind of human. This human traveled faster than falcons, which is quite something, because falcons can go up to 390 kilometers per hour. But not only did they travel faster than falcons, they also spoke in tongues that would reach further than the oceans. Now, the falcons felt very similar to them as they started to roam the world, and they called them roamers. And so they decided to become their constant companions. And from now on, you would recognize these roamers by the falcons that would cycle in the sky above them. Now, next to these roamers, there still existed the settled humans. And the settled humans felt sort of threatened by the new ideals and lifestyles that these roamers had brought about. However, they soon relied on them to build their towers higher and higher into the skies. And these were monuments of settled existence. The roamers, however, had given up settled life, and therefore they didn't enjoy any longer the protection and the rights that they had enjoyed in their home communities. And so they started to suffer from unkind oppression and abuse. And the falcons witnessed these injustices, and they dove from the skies in order to alert others. Unfortunately, their call for help remained unheard for a very long time. Until one day, when yet another human appeared, and the falcons called them provider. Now, the provider fitted the falcon with an extra pair of eyes that would allow them to see what the falcons saw. And so they would witness the injustices that were done to the roamers. But also they created an invisible net around the world that would link the roamers and turn them into a collective that could stand in for one another, and therefore it empowered them. The settled societies, again, were quite wary about that. They felt threatened about that empowerment. And so they sent ambassadors that would ask this new collective to follow certain rights and rules and regulations. And so it was that an agreement was forged. And this agreement would guarantee the roamers unlimited freedom of movement, but they had to live a constant life in motion. That means if they saw the sun rise more than 180 times in the same place, that had to move on. Now, years gone by, and although this agreement was made, the settled and the unsettled never felt at ease with one another. However, the elderly of the settled societies, they started to envy this freedom that the roamers enjoyed. And so they went to the falcon and asked him if they could join in to that collective under his watch. But the falcon didn't feel so similar to these recreationalists who were only traveling for fun. And so he also felt overwhelmed watching yet another kind of human. Not being given what they wanted, the recreationalists asked their ambassadors to come up with a better agreement. And by that time, this collective had been discussed by the settled societies as something that was some sort of government, some sort of nation, some sort of statehood, but without representative territory. And so it was that the first diplomatic relationships were forged. By that time, young people had been born into this collective, and they had grown up with a new set of ideals, with a very flexible lifestyle, and they called themselves motionists. Now, those motionists were very proud of their existence, and they had never lived a settled life. So they started to arrange gatherings all over the world. And in these gatherings, they would meet the roamers, the recreationalists, the falcons, and the providers, and they would together perform a spectacular dance, and they would proudly celebrate their life in motion. Now, not only did all of these peregrine societies meet, the settled societies would join in, and they would admire those performances in awe. And so it was that by this time, based on the principles of motion, a new sort of government had forged. And this government was one that followed people around. So it was based on individuals rather than on territory. And therefore it was named INDIVICRACY. Now, if you're lucky enough, you might come across one of those dances and witness the Peregrine Society celebrate a life in motion. Now, the story I just told you was on display in the Design Museum until the beginning of this year. And it was part of the Designers in Residence exhibition, which was themed around migration. Next to the story, there were artifacts on display and masks. And I really wanted the visitors to feel as though they had come to a museum for cultural history that would talk about a future nation rather than about the past one. And next to the artifacts, there was a room that you could enter, and an interactive installation would allow you to meet the different characters. So you would get to know their story and their reason for migrating. But also, you could learn their dance, and therefore you could join into this new culture. So you could celebrate a life in motion. We also had a special event where visitors were actually allowed to join the parliament of this INDIVICRACY, this new form of government. So people had to vote for and against new rules and regulations. And what I wanted them to do is not just to engage with politics in a fun way, but actually start to rethink current political systems, which are currently also really challenged by globalization and technology. I worked with a lot of brilliant minds on this project, and one of them was Didi Veldman, a choreographer, who helped me to understand national dances. And we came up with certain routines within this dance that would reflect the motivations of the different characters. So for example, the first one was a migrant worker. And migrant workers travel between their home and one country where they work. And they travel back and forth and back and forth. So the main motion was basically the back and forth movement, but you'd also see the falcon in between. And that's what national dancers do. They reference their surroundings and they tell the stories of a society. Now, a little bit about my background. As mentioned, I run a design platform called Peut-Porter together with some friends. And Peut-Porter is a crossover of the words Peut-être and Pret-a-Porter. So what we try to do is that we design basically what might be worn in the future. But really, as also mentioned, we understand garments as social reactors that can create vision. And by doing so, they allow us an alternative perspective. I think garments at their very best show our social borders by visualizing and manifesting them. But also, as they do that, they help us to bring them down. So if you see images like these in the press today, the first thing that will come to your mind is some sort of working class story due to the blue overalls, the blue collars. But really what we know by now is that the article that has this image is talking about some sort of slave-like conditions that migrant workers experience all over the world today. A little fact for you. So in 2013, Human Rights Watch actually released a report that stated that 88.5% of the residents of the United Arab Emirates were poor migrant workers. Now, a lot of these people left their home country and were deprived of their legal rights. And I wonder why governments do have to stay where we move. But what I'm trying to get to is that these images become so powerful because we understand through the blue overalls that there's an issue at hand and that there is a massive amount of people that we are talking about. And actually there is Walter Benjamin who says that arts as well as fashion are visual semaphores. And they not only tell us about new currents within the arts, but about new legal codes, about wars, about revolutions that will come. So my question is, if we can read these visual semaphores, can we as designers not also write them? Well, you might think that INDIVICRACY and the story of the falcon is really a big dream. But I think if we start to imagine these futures in detail, we are one step closer to actually making them happen. I always like to bring this example. So if you think of any sci-fi movie that is maybe a little bit older, you'll realize that a lot of the technology that they suggested is reality today. So sci-fi movies are pretty good in predicting, but also making it happen. Now this film is not a sci-fi film, but it's a film called Zorbas the Greek, and some of you might know it. It's from 1964. It's actually showing Anthony Quinn dancing the sirtaki quite a bit. The sirtaki is the Greek national dance, or so it seems, because actually the Greek original national dance was much too complex. So Anthony Quinn, not being Greek, couldn't dance it. And therefore the film came up with a simplified version. But then the film became very popular. And so now the whole world understands this dance as the Greek national dance. And it forged a part of the national identity of Greece. So what I hope to do with INDIVICRACY is forge a new sort of national identity that we can join in and celebrate. Another part that inspired my project were obviously a lot of books that I read, but also very important people and political scientists I talked to. And one book by Tony Fry, who I also talked to about the project, was particularly important. Tony Fry is a design theorist and a philosopher, and he has a studio called The Studio at the Edge of the World. And what he does is he tries to come up with projects that work around sustainability, not just environmentally sustainable projects, but projects that suggest systems that are sustainable. And in this book, he writes, somehow, and sooner rather than later, how we dwell in ourselves and how we dwell with all other beings in this world around us has to change radically. Now, most importantly, he says, for this to happen, a culture very different from the current cultures in dominance has to emerge. I think the current culture in dominance, and I think he would agree with me because he also talks a lot about nomadism, is the settled existence. And the one culture that should emerge is one that I'd like to design for. And that's one where we cross borders on an everyday basis. So today, really, there's individuals who blur our boundaries. And therefore, they forge an important part of our future. Because they question systems that have been set in stone, such as the nation state. And they really ask us to redesign democracy to fit the new forms of society we have. And therefore, we shouldn't call them refugees or migrants. Thank you.
Thank you.